All right, hey folks, welcome to week number 6, which is counting in music, part number 2. We are going to take a look at counting some different note values, and we are going to take a look at reviewing the different things that we have already worked on when it comes to counting. So the first thing that we're going to do, like I said, is we're going to review a little bit here. So if you do need to, go ahead and hit the pause button, and we are going to take a moment to kind of review all the different notes that you've got here. So each of the things that you're seeing here is going to be the name of the note, that rhythm syllable that we use, the counting pattern, and the number of beats that it gets. So now please remember, when you see the number signs, what some of you refer to as hashtags, which they're not, they're number signs. The number signs are telling you the variable. It's telling you that you're going to count a certain number or group of numbers. So now, like for example, the quarter note, you see a single number sign right there. That means that it gets one whole number. So whether it's going to be beat 1, 2, 3, or 4, it is going to get a single whole number, and that's all that it gets. The other ones that we have here have hyphens next to them, and that means that they are going to include more than one number. So that means that they are going to have, like, for example, beats 2 and 3 together. So for the half note, if it was to start on beat 2, the first number sign means that it starts on beat 2. The second number sign means it ends on beat number 3. They are attached together to remind us that they are going to be working together to take up both of those beats. Now, the only ones we didn't really get to is the eighth note pair and the single eighth note. So we are going to dig into those more today. We are going to work on what that means, and we are going to figure out how to count those pairs of eighth notes. So go ahead and pause the video here, and we will get going here in just a second with the next review page that we're going to take a look at. So hit pause now, review those notes, and we'll get going. All right, thank you. And we're on to our rests now, ladies and gentlemen. So the rests, remember, are almost identical to the notes that they share the name with. So that quarter rest right there is going to get one beat, just like the quarter note. So if they share a name, they are going to share a number of beats. So that's a great way to remember the quarter notes and quarter rests, half notes, whole rests, whole notes, things like that. So the big thing to remember about this, though, is that the rests are going to represent silence, whereas notes are going to represent sound. So once again, that counting pattern is going to be depending on where in that measure it shows up. So go ahead and hit the pause button right now and review those different rests. All right, thank you for taking a moment to review those different rests, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to review counting just in general here. So remember, the first step for counting is always going to be to look at your time signature. And what the time signature does is tell us what number we are going to be counting to. The time signature controls every measure inside the music, and what that does is it tells us how many beats are inside each measure, and therefore what number we're going to count up to. Now, even though we have a time signature that's going to control the number of beats, each new measure is always going to start back at the number 1. So that means that each time we finish a measure, we don't continue on to 5, 6, 7, 8. We go back to 1 every single time. So when you count music, it is like using a number line, like that analogy that I made before. Each note is going to have its own place inside that measure. You can't have a couple notes sharing number 1. That's not how it's going to work. We are going to use each number for itself, and sometimes they get combined, but we are always going to be counting up to whatever number is inside that time signature. So again, reviewing the rhythm that we had worked on last time, we can look here and we can remind ourselves how this goes. We see we're in 4/4 time. We see we have a half note, we have a quarter rest, and a quarter note. We know that we are counting to 4, and that means that when we start with our half note, just like I said right there, we're counting to 4. When we start with our half note, we're always going to start with the number 1. We know it receives 2 beats, so it's going to take up beats 1 and 2 inside of that measure. So the half note is going to take up beats 1 and 2. Now the arrow there, remember, means that we are only going to say that first number. We do not say 1, 2, because that's two different sounds. We only want that one sound. So when we have our half note, 1, it gives us that long sound telling us that beats 1 and 2 are taken up by that half note. The quarter rest there, we already know that the quarter rest, highlighted in purple, is going to be a silent rhythm. It's going to tell us that there is space there, that we are not going to produce sound. So even though it is silent, it still gets a number of beats. It still gets one beat. This was something I saw a little bit last week in those review questions. Some of us had in our heads that rests, just because they're silent, don't get beats. No, unfortunately, that is not correct. They do still take up space, because if we didn't take up space with them, what's the point in having a symbol for a rest if it doesn't mean anything, right? So even though they are silent, they still get a set number of beats. So because we already used up beats 1 and 2, beat 3 is going to be right there inside parentheses to show that we are thinking it, not saying it. Finally, we get to the quarter note, which we still know gets one beat. The only number that is remaining is number 4, because we've already used up beats 1 and 2 for your half note. Those two are attached together by that hyphen. We've used up beat number 3 for the quarter rest inside of our parentheses. So the only remaining number is beat number 4, which is right there for our quarter note. And because we have reached number 4, we finished counting that measure. So now the main point of today's lesson is going to be counting shorter note values and counting longer rests. We are going to start with counting those shorter note values. So it says here, up until now, we have counted whole numbers. There are, however, different types of notes that do not get whole beats. So what this means is we are breaking down the notes into fractions. So we no longer always have to use whole numbers like 1, 2, 3, or 4. We can use those smaller parts of a beat to create shorter sounds. This is something called subdividing. All right, so go ahead and say that word out loud right now. I'll say it, then you say it. Subdividing. All right, so subdividing means you are going to take a whole number and break it down into smaller parts. Think of like a city or a town. A subdivision where you might live, kind of like where I live, is a small piece of that town. So when you subdivide notes, you are going to break them down into smaller pieces from a larger number. So eighth notes are a great example of a subdivided note. So counting eighth notes, this can get a little bit tricky, so we're going to go through it reasonably slow and try to make sure that this makes as much sense as possible. So eighth notes are a shorter type of note. It produces two sounds inside the space of one beat. So now, if you are making two sounds in the space of one beat, that means that those sounds need to be what? Shorter or longer? What do you think? Shorter is absolutely right. You do need to shorten those sounds to fit more of them inside that space. So what that means is that each eighth note is going to receive 1/2 of a beat, because if we take 1 and we divide it by 2, we're going to get 1/2 on each one. And we can check this because when we add those two halves together, we get back to our whole number 1, which we know the eighth note receives that as its number of beats. All right, so each individual eighth note is going to get 1/2 of a beat, which means it's going to go faster than like the quarter note, for example. It's going to go faster than something that gets a whole number because it gets a fraction or a subdivision of a number. So now knowing that eighth notes receive half a beat each is absolutely not the same as counting them. So very much like in the last part where we said that it's not enough to know just the number of beats that each note receives, we have to know how to place those eighth notes inside of our measure. So now eighth notes are variable, just like quarter notes or half notes. That means that they can go just about anywhere inside that measure. They do not always have a set number that they appear on. That's what the word variable means. It means it changes. It does not always stay the same or consistent. So the counting pattern of eighth notes is the number of the beat followed by a plus sign. So right there, we've got the number of the beat. So whatever variable number it's going to be, 1, 2, 3, or 4, followed by a plus sign, which means the word and. So once again, we have the number of the beat followed by a plus sign, and the plus sign means the word and. Now we use a plus sign so we don't have to write out the word and underneath everything. It's a lot easier to draw a plus sign than to write the word and each time that we're writing down our counting. So we're using a symbol to represent a word. Okay? So if we consider this rhythm right here, we have 3 quarter notes and 1 pair of eighth notes. Now, as we learned last time, each quarter note is going to get the number of the beat that it is on for its counting pattern. So if we look here at this rhythm, we can see that we have quarter notes on beats 1, 3, and 4. Now, how do we know it's 1, 3, and 4? Because if we're thinking about where they are inside that measure, and we know that quarter notes get whole numbers, and eighth notes are the number of the beat plus the and, we can figure out that because the eighth note comes in second position on that measure, we can pretty readily think, okay, so that means that the eighth notes are going to start on beat number 2. That leaves beats 1, 3, and 4 for our quarter notes. Now, like I just said, we learned in previous slides, we look at the numbers present and we can see that beat 2 doesn't have any counting yet, and this is where the eighth notes are going to be. In previous slides, we learned that the first eighth note of each pair is always going to be the number of the beat. Now, this is especially important. You've got to remember this part. The first eighth note of each pair. Now, it has to be the pair of eighth notes for this strategy to work. We will get into single eighth notes a little bit later on, but I want to focus on the pair of eighth notes right now. So the first eighth note of each pair, going from left to right, is always going to be the number of the beat that you are on. In this example, it is beat number 2 because it is in that second position inside the measure. Now that we've used up beat number 2, we can see that there is still an eighth note that does not have a count associated with it. And this is where we have to use that word subdivide to add an extra syllable to our counting in order to create that second shorter sound for the eighth note. So now the second eighth note of each pair for our purposes is always going to be the plus sign. Now again, be very careful that it's the second eighth note of each pair. It absolutely has to be the pair for it to always be the and. All right, so it's the word and it's notated by a plus sign. You can see it there circled in purple. So if we were to count this, we'll go back here for just a moment. If we were to count this, we know that we have beats 1 through 4. So if I'm going to give you a steady beat, we know that beat 2 has to have a subdivision on it. So that means that we're going to say the word and for that plus sign, making the 2 and the and shorter beats because they're in the space of one of our steady beat. So for example, we would get 1, 2, and 3, 4. Now the reason we have that 2 and is because we have to put those 2 sounds in the space of that one beat. Listen carefully one more time. 1, 2, and 3, 4. Now, each time my finger snaps, that's another beat. That's our steady beat. staying right there. So to get that eighth note, the and comes when I'm not snapping. 1, 2, and 3, 4. You can hear it in the space between beats 2 and 3. So that's where we get that subdivided figure. I want you to try that now, please, okay? So I'm going to say 1, 2, ready, go, just like our follow me rhythms. And I want you to try saying 1, 2, and 3, 4. So here it goes. 1, 2, here we go. 1, 2, and 3, 4. Try it by yourself. Now, ready, and go. All right, hopefully we're starting to get that, and hopefully you're starting to see that that's how that eighth note is going to be written out. Now, remember, one thing to keep in mind is eighth notes are variable. So if you look here, they are not always going to be the same. It is not always going to say to and. It will be different. Okay? Another thing to keep in mind is that eighth notes are short notes, which means you do need to subdivide them. So they do need to go faster than some of the other notes that are around them. And the eighth note is always going to have the second group, or the second one of each group, labeled as that plus sign, which means the word and. Those 3 points are really important to keep in mind. So let me say it one more time for you. The most important things to remember about eighth notes are that they are variables, which means that the number of the beat will not always be the same. That number sign that you see right there will not always be a consistent number. It will change. It will be something different inside each different measure where the eighth notes show up. They are short notes, which means that we do need to subdivide them and make them go a little bit faster than the notes that are around them. And the second or eighth note of each group is always going to be the plus sign, which is pronounced like the word and. So please remember those 3 points about eighth notes. So now getting in here to counting longer rests. We have shorter notes, yes, that we do need to learn how to do, but we do need to occasionally count longer note values. Now we talked about half notes and whole notes in a previous screen recording. We saved the half and whole rests for right now because even though they are silent, we still need to learn how to count them in our head to make sure that they take up the appropriate number of beats, the appropriate amount of space. So the 2 ones that we have not learned how to count yet are the half rest with the blue line right there going to the top figure, and the whole rest with the green line going to the bottom figure. Now remember, the half rest we can remember because it looks as if you could put it on. It's got the box up on top like a hat. The whole rest looks as if you could walk along and fall into it. The box is underneath the line as if it was a hole dug out of the ground. So let's consider for a moment, I'm going to move my image out of the way here. So I'm going on a little field trip up to the top of the page. So let's consider for a moment the half rest and the half note. Now counting the half rest works almost identical to our half note. The biggest difference is that the half rest is going to represent silence. So what that means is they are going to be counted inside of parentheses. Now you can see that on the screen right there. Both the half note and the half rest receive 2 beats, which means they are going to be counted by using the number you start on, along with the number you end on, attached to one another by a hyphen. Now, this is important because that shows that those 2 numbers are part of the same note. Now, we just learned that eighth notes are 2 short sounds in the space of 1 beat. Half notes and half rests are 1 longer sound or space of silence over the course of 2 beats. So that means that it does need to take up more space, not less space. So remember, those are variables as well. It means that they are not always going to show up on beat 1 or beat 2 or beat 3. They are going to have different numbers in place of those number signs, depending on where they are inside each measure. The whole rest works just the same as the whole note. So now the difference again is that the whole rest represents silence and once again is placed inside parentheses. Now this one is not a variable, this is a constant. So constant is the opposite of variable when we're talking about things like this. This is a constant, and what that means is that it always is going to have the same counting pattern because we are in 4/4 time. And that means that the whole note and the whole rest take up the entire measure that it is part of. So rather than having 4 number signs, we are going to know that the whole note is going to take up all 4 beats, just like the whole rest. Now, they do need to be attached by a hyphen, once again showing that it is one sound in the space of 4 beats. So it is a long sound or a long space of silence. So like I said, it is not a variable. It will always have 1, 2, 3, and 4 attached by those hyphens to show that those numbers are together. All right, everybody. So I know that counting gets a little bit tricky and a little bit iffy every once in a while. We are going to get a little bit of an opportunity to practice. I am going to have another screencast of those different rhythms that I would like you to try to count. So you're going to grab a piece of paper, you're going to grab a writing utensil, pencil, pen, whatever you want to use, and you are going to be writing down those notes to write out the counting patterns, just like we did a couple of weeks ago when we first learned how to count our half notes, quarter notes, and quarter rests. So we're going to add our eighth notes, we're going to add our longer rest values, and we are going to take a look at that coming up here in just a moment. So let's move on to the next part of the video, and we are going to learn and get a chance to practice counting those different note values.